My name is Riley Carter. I was born and raised in Ashfield, a quiet town in northern Washington, where reputation meant everything. In our house, it wasn't about kindness or curiosity. It was about achievement. My dad, Richard Carter, taught economics at the University of Washington. Always buttoned-up hair, perfectly parted eyes, scanning everyone like they were a lecture hall. My mom, Diane Carter, was the principal of Ashfield High. Rules, discipline, perfection, that was her whole world. And then there was my sister, Emily. Emily could recite the Constitution by 5 and won debate championships before she hit double digits. By 17, she had a scholarship offer from Stanford. I remember the night she announced it. A big family dinner, my dad's glass raised high. This is what success looks like. Everyone laughed. I didn't. I felt invisible as usual. That was always my place, quietly different. I liked computers. At 12, I fixed our neighbor's printer, 410 and a slice of pie. At 15, I built a website for a local bakery, and they made their first online sale that same week. I thought my parents would be proud. Instead, my mom just sighed. "That won't get you into Harvard, Riley." My dad didn't even look up from his paper. "You want to fix laptops for a living? Fine, but not under my roof. You're my." So I learned to smile quietly while Emily's achievements echoed around the house. And I hid my ambitions, a little project I called Local Goods. I was building a simple online marketplace for local artists and craftspeople. Not flashy, just real. By my senior year of high school, the college applications lined the kitchen table like trophies. My dad had carefully arranged brochures from Yale, Columbia, Princeton. I stared at them and felt nothing but dread. That night at dinner, I finally spoke. "I'm not applying to college," I said. My hands shaking, but my voice clear. "I'm starting my own business. I already have clients, and I've saved up nearly $5,000. Silence. My mom's fork hit her plate. My dad slowly stood, his face stone cold. "That is not happening," he said. "Not while you live here." His tone didn't crack. His expression didn't soften. He looked at me like I was some stranger who had just tracked mud through the house. I didn't cry. I just stood up, packed my things that night, and left the next morning before sunrise. No hugs, no well wishes, nothing. I found a tiny apartment in Tacoma, a third-floor walk-up with peeling paint, old creaky floors, and drafty windows. It was mine, though. The kitchen was so small that I could touch both walls at once. I set up an old wooden table near the only good outlet and made it my office. Every morning, I brewed coffee in a cheap drip machine, pulled my hoodie tight, and got to work. No salary, no expectations, just me and my idea. Local Goods was my shot at helping small artisans sell online. I didn't want to compete with Amazon. I just wanted to help local people get noticed. The first month was rough. I cold emailed dozens of artists and shop owners. Most never replied. A few laughed when they learned I hadn't even gone to college. My bank account dwindled fast. Ramen noodles became my main meal. The space heater ran all night, not just to keep the cold out, but to fight back the creeping fear that maybe, just maybe, I had made a huge mistake. One night, in a moment of weakness, I called my mom, just to hear a familiar voice. Her words cut sharper than the winter wind. "You can always come home, Riley, as long as you start college applications." I hung up without replying. I sat on the floor and stared at my laptop until morning. 3 months in Local Goods had exactly 2 clients, Hannah, a woman who made soaps, and Carl, an elderly woodcarver who kept calling me Rachel, no matter how many times I corrected him. They were kind. They kept me going. Then came the car accident. It was February. I was dropping off a shipment for Hannah when an old truck rear-ended my Honda Civic at a red light. No injuries, but my car wouldn't start again. The mechanics estimate $850. I didn't have it. I barely had feet. That night, sitting cross-legged on my old carpet with unpaid bills piling up, I almost gave up. But something inside me wouldn't let me quit. Instead, I forced myself out of my apartment to attend a small business networking event at the Tacoma Public Library, a free event I'd bookmarked weeks ago, but ignored. I didn't expect much. But that's where I met Evelyn Brooks. Evelyn was in her late 50s, silver hair in a loose braid, glasses perched low on her nose. She ran a regional accounting software company and gave a talk that wasn't flashy, but felt real. No jargon, just truth about building something from scratch. After the Q&A, I waited until everyone else left and then nervously approached her. "Hi, I'm Riley," I stammered, nearly dropping my homemade business card. "I run a small platform helping artisans sell online. No degree, no fancy backers, but it's real. I have real clients." Evelyn studied me for a moment, then asked, "Do you have any data?" I opened my laptop and showed her the little dashboard I had cobbled together: 2 clients, a few dozen orders, a trickle of growth. She nodded thoughtfully. "You're going about this all wrong," she said. "You don't need more individual sellers. You need business clients. Why sell 1 bar of soap when you can sell your software to 50 craft stores?" Her words hit me like a lightning bolt. Right there that night, something changed. We kept talking for hours. She didn't treat me like a dropout kid. She treated me like an entrepreneur. By the time I walked back to my freezing apartment, the fear in my chest was replaced by something else, a spark. The beginning of a plan. And that's where part 1 ends, not with success yet, but with possibility. Tomorrow, everything would begin again. I woke up the next morning and realized something had shifted inside me. This wasn't just about proving a point anymore, it was survival. Craftcore couldn't stay a small side project. It had to be a real company, fast. Evelyn's words from the library echoed loud, "Stop thinking like a hobbyist." My cold apartment felt even colder, but I sat down at that battered old table and started working with a new kind of urgency. First step, rebranding. Local goods sounded like a roadside stand, not a platform that could manage inventory for real businesses. I scribbled names on sticky notes, crossed out 20, circled 1 Craftcore. Short, sharp, serious. That was going to be my new identity. I redesigned the website that same night, tweaking every line of copy to sound less like a scrappy freelancer and more like a company with a plan. I stayed up until 3 in the morning, coding new features, better inventory tools, multi-store management capabilities, integration with QuickBooks. The heater rattled next to me, barely keeping the chill at bay, but I kept going. The next few days blurred together. I sent out dozens of cold emails, this time to small chains instead of individual artisans. Most didn't reply. A few flat out rejected me. But then came a single plain reply from a craft supply chain in Spokane. "Can your software manage multi-store inventory and integrate with QuickBooks?" My heart jumped. I stared at the screen for what felt like minutes before typing back, "Yes, I can demo it Friday." Of course, I had no such demo. Yet. That was the first major gamble. Promise first, figure it out second. I worked for 3 days straight, eating ramen and drinking coffee until my hands shook. I wrote and rewrote, code, built dashboards, tested everything on fake data I invented just to fill the screens. The whole time I wondered what they'd think if they knew Craftcore was just me alone in a freezing apartment with peeling paint and a laptop that overheated if I pushed it too hard. But Friday came and I delivered. The dashboard looked clean, the inventory system worked, and the automated alerts I'd hacked together looked polished. The buyer asked smart questions. I answered confidently, even though I felt like an imposter every second. And then the next shoe dropped. "This looks good. When can you come to Spokane to meet in person?" That question hung heavy. My car was still broken, sitting at the mechanic with an unpaid repair estimate. My bank account wouldn't cover gas to Spokane, let alone lodging. I hesitated, then typed the only thing I could: "I can be there Tuesday." So I took the bus. 8 hours across the state, wedged between strangers, rehearsing my pitch, silently heart-pounding. I stayed at a cheap motel that reeked of smoke, stood in front of the cracked bathroom mirror the night before, running through my demo like I was presenting to an auditorium. My best outfit, clean jeans and a hoodie. I had nothing else. But I kept telling myself if the work is good enough, they'll see past that. The next morning, I walked into that meeting room at 9 a.m., stomach-churning laptop under my arm. The conference table gleamed. Their executives all wore tailored shirts, their shoes polished. I sat down, plugged in my laptop, and walked them through every feature I'd built. I talked fast, but steady. I showed them how Craftcore could replace their ancient system and save them hours of manual work. When I finished, they fell silent. For a second, I feared the worst. Then the operations manager leaned back and said something that changed everything. "We're desperate. When can you deploy this?" I almost couldn't breathe. We signed a contract right there, $80,000 for rollout at 8 stores, $25,000 upfront. That wire transfer hit my account the next morning, and for the first time since leaving my parents' house, I felt like I had made it, if only for a moment. I could finally pay the electric bill. I could finally repair my old car. But deeper than that, I felt legitimate. I was no longer playing at being a business owner, I was one. I thought about calling my parents. I imagined my dad's skeptical voice, my mom's carefully measured praise that always sounded more like criticism. But I stopped myself. I wasn't doing this for them. I was building CraftCore for me, for that kid who had once been told that coding websites and fixing printers was just a silly hobby. The weeks that followed were a blur. More stores reached out. Word was spreading somehow. I hired my first contractor, Jonah, a developer who'd been laid off from a Seattle tech firm. He was smart, funny, and grateful for the work. We worked out of my tiny apartment, rotating who got to use the single good chair and joking about how we'd someday have a real office. The work was hard, the hours longer than I thought possible. Sometimes we ate cold pizza at 2 a.m. while debugging inventory sync issues. But every contract signed felt like another piece of armor, a layer that made me feel less like a fraud. And then came an email that shook me, a chain that had rejected me early on, now wanted to revisit our conversation. I read that line 5 times, not sure if it was a joke. The market that had once ignored me was starting to come back around, but success was demanding. Jonah pulled me aside one night as we wrestled with a bug in the shipping integration. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. "You look exhausted all the time." I waved him off, but he wasn't wrong. I hadn't spoken to a friend in weeks. I hadn't seen daylight in days. The pressure was enormous, not just to keep succeeding, but to prove to myself that this gamble wasn't foolish. We kept expanding. More features, better analytics. Dashboards that let store managers track everything from seasonal demand to low stock warnings. CraftCore was no longer a scrappy passion project. It was turning into an enterprise platform that businesses relied on. But late one night, sitting at that same battered table, the heater groaning as always, an open energy drink sweating beside my laptop, it hit me. I was winning, but I was doing it alone. That loneliness crept into every corner of my apartment. There were no more texts from friends asking if I wanted to meet for drinks, no dinners out, no lazy Sundays watching movies. CraftCore consumed everything. That realization scared me in a way that nothing else had. Success was starting to feel empty. And so, almost on impulse, I opened my calendar and saw Evelyn Brooks was hosting another networking night at the library downtown. I hadn't seen her since that first night when everything started changing. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, a reminder maybe that I wasn't the only person struggling to build something from nothing. I shut my laptop, grabbed my jacket, and headed out into the cold night air. As I stepped into that warm, crowded meeting room, faces new and old conversations, buzzing people, pitching ideas, and laughing, I felt something shift again. I didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where CraftCore would grow beyond just me, and where I might finally stop building alone. That night at the library networking event, I kept mostly to myself at first, just watching. The room felt warmer than my apartment had in weeks, not just the temperature, but the atmosphere. It was filled with that mixture of hope and desperation that I recognized so well. Young founders pitching ideas, older entrepreneurs sharing lessons, awkward icebreakers, and quiet confidence blooming in the corners. I remembered how lost I'd been when I first met Evelyn, and suddenly I felt older, sharper, scarred, but resilient. Evelyn found me near the coffee table. "You look different," she said, a half smile on her face. "Less desperate." "That's good." I laughed softly. "I don't feel less desperate, honestly. Just different desperate." Her gaze sharpened. "That's called leadership." Different desperate is when you're trying to protect what you built, not just trying to survive. I didn't say anything at first. I just nodded because I felt seen again. And as if on cue, Evelyn added, "You know, Riley, the hardest thing isn't building a product. It's learning how not to disappear inside it." That line stayed with me as I left the library that night. It followed me back to my apartment, hung in the air while I answered late-night emails and debugged another stubborn bug in the analytics dashboard. It haunted me quietly while Jonah snored lightly on the sofa, crashed after another exhausting 14-hour day. Craftcore was thriving, but I was drowning. 2 weeks later, my moment of reckoning arrived. A national chain, Maple and Sage, emailed me out of nowhere. Their operations manager had seen Craftcore in action at a competitor's store and wanted a meeting. Maple and Sage wasn't a small operation. They had 50 stores across 6 states and an outdated inventory system that barely functioned. This was it, the client that could transform Craftcore from regional success to national player. My pulse raced as I read their message. "Could you visit our Denver headquarters next week? We're evaluating platforms." I replied immediately, "Absolutely, looking forward to it." And then panic set in. I had no team ready for an enterprise-scale implementation. Jonah and I were stretched thin, supporting the handful of stores we had. My documentation was patchy at best. If Maple and Sage signed on, Craftcore would double in scope overnight and probably break under the strain. But turning this down wasn't an option. This was what I had built for. So I did the only thing that made sense. I lied to myself, told myself we'd figure it out as we went, and booked a flight to Denver, using almost the last of my contract advance. The plane ride was turbulent, literally and figuratively. As we crossed the Rockies, my mind spun with scenarios, deployment plans, training schedules, scaling architecture I hadn't finished designing. Every part of me screamed that this was reckless. But I'd lived on risk for months. This was just a bigger bet. The next morning, I stood in Maple and Sage's polished Denver headquarters. Glass walls, brushed steel fixtures, the soft hum of corporate efficiency. The reception desk alone looked like it cost more than my entire apartment. When I introduced myself to Rebecca, their head of operations, she gave me a firm handshake, but eyed me up and down, plain blazer-scuffed shoes, tired eyes. "Tell me about your team," she said within minutes of sitting down. I hesitated for half a second too long. "We're a tight, nimble group," I said carefully. "Fast, adaptable, small by design." That earned me a raised eyebrow, but she didn't press. Instead, she handed me their specs, their current software stack, their store layout data, their pain points. "We need this deployed in all 50 locations within 90 days, she said plainly. "Can you do that?" That was the second big risk I said yes before even looking at the full requirements. Back in Tacoma that night, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at my laptop as Jonah worked silently next to me. He didn't ask if we could do it. He didn't scold me for overpromising. He just opened a notebook and said, "Okay, let's break this down." That was when I understood that Craftcore wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone willing to shoulder that kind of impossible burden with me. Jonah and I worked until dawn, sketching new architecture diagrams on sticky notes, laying out sprints, drafting onboarding guides. Every problem we solved just unlocked 3 more. I found myself balancing on the edge between exhilaration and complete burnout. And then, like clockwork, my family intruded on my thoughts again. An email from my mother, "Haven't heard from you in a while. Just wondering if you've reconsidered applying to grad school. Emily's starting her MBA this fall. Thought you'd want to know." No mention of Craftcore. No curiosity about my life, my work, my first real clients. Just the same old assumptions. I didn't reply. I couldn't afford the emotional tax. I had a deadline, a contract, a company to save. But even as I ignored them, I felt their voices in my head as I worked those early judgments about what success looked like, what ambition was supposed to mean, who got to claim respect, and who didn't. I coded late into the night with that tension humming under my skin, every line of code a quiet rebellion against the beliefs they'd taught me to swallow. Jonah and I hired 2 more contractors friends of his who'd also been laid off. We worked from my tiny apartment in shifts, our laptops balanced on crates and boxes, the heater blasting takeout containers piling up. We held stand-up meetings sitting on my floor. We built software on adrenaline and caffeine, and the fear that failure would mean not just financial ruin, but emotional collapse. But strangely, as chaotic as it was, it felt right. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who didn't care where I went to school, didn't care about my family's opinions, didn't ask why I chose this path. They just cared about whether CraftCore worked, whether our code was clean, whether our features shipped. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I was building tools to help small businesses survive while barely surviving myself. My apartment was a contradiction, barely livable, but a hive of growth and innovation. My hoodie was a kind of armor signaling that I belonged outside those polished boardrooms. And the software itself, elegant and fast, was my answer to every dismissal I'd ever heard from my family's dinner table. As the deployment deadline approached, the cracks widened. Jonah pulled an all-nighter alone when I finally crashed from sheer exhaustion. I woke up to find he'd built the entire inventory syncing system without me. His notes scrawled across the fridge door with a dry erase marker. "Sleep matters too," he wrote underneath with a smiley face. We made it. 90 days later, I flew back to Denver, not on borrowed money this time, but as a vendor delivering on a contract worth 6 figures. The rollout went smoothly. The Maple and Sage execs smiled for the first time when they saw our real-time dashboards in action. I shook their hands, posed for photos, and signed the final invoice. On the flight back, I stared out at the clouds and realized something profound. I hadn't just built CraftCore to prove something to my family or even to myself. I'd built it because I believed that small businesses deserved better tools than what they had. That belief had kept me going through every setback, every sleepless night. But I also realized that I couldn't keep living like this, isolated, disconnected, pouring everything into work with nothing left over for myself. So that's when I made a decision that surprised even me. I'd take the next Saturday off. No code, no emails, no debugging. Just me alone, sitting quietly somewhere that wasn't my apartment. I didn't know what would come after that day off. I didn't know if I'd keep racing toward the next contract or if I'd finally slow down and look around at what I'd built. But I knew the life I was building now didn't look anything like what my parents expected. It didn't come with diplomas on the wall or polite conversations about career advancement over family dinners. It was raw and risky and exhausting, but it was mine. And as the plane began its descent back into Seattle, I smiled, because for the first time since I left home, I wasn't afraid of what came next. That first Saturday off didn't go as planned. I woke up early, instinctively reaching for my laptop before I remembered I wasn't coding today. No emails, no debugging, just breathe. It felt awkward, like I'd forgotten how to exist without a to-do list dictating every hour. I grabbed my jacket and walked down to a small park near my apartment. The morning air was sharp and clean, a reminder that I'd barely been outside in weeks. Families strolled by, kids chasing each other in circles, couples sipping coffee from paper cups. Normal people, I thought. People who didn't define their worth by how many contracts they closed this quarter. I sat on a park bench and watched a little girl on the swings laughing freely as her father pushed her higher. For a moment, I envied that ease, that freedom from expectation. But the envy faded quickly into something else, resolve. I had built something real. I had taken every dismissal, every judgment from my family, and turned it into fuel. But sitting still didn't come naturally anymore. By midday, I wandered into a bookstore cafe, ordered a black coffee, and found myself sketching out a roadmap for CraftCore's next phase on the back of a napkin. The irony made me laugh under my breath. Even on my day off, I couldn't stop building. That night, I called Evelyn. "So much for relaxing," I confessed. She laughed knowingly. "Riley, some of us build because we can't help it. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't find your balance." Her words lingered even after we hung up. That balance felt elusive. Every time I slowed down, a new email arrived, a new opportunity knocking harder than the last. I was no longer chasing success, success was chasing me. And with that, success came invitations, industry panels, podcasts, startup competitions. Suddenly, people wanted to hear my story, the college dropout who built an enterprise SaaS platform from a tiny apartment. I said no to most of them at first, but one invitation felt different, a small business conference in Seattle, not far from where I grew up. The topic, redefining success building on your own terms. The symbolism was too perfect to ignore. I accepted. As I prepared my talk, I felt the old doubts creeping in. What would I even say? That I left home with nothing but a cracked laptop and a fragile sense of purpose, that I survived on ramen and fear, that I coded through exhaustion and self-doubt while my family celebrated my sister's MBA. Was that really a story worth telling, or just survival dressed up as strategy? But then I realized that was exactly why I needed to speak. CraftCore's story wasn't neat or polished. It was messy and flawed and human. And maybe, just maybe, someone sitting in that audience would recognize themselves in that struggle. The night before the conference, I barely slept. I wrote and rewrote my notes, pacing the floor of my apartment, occasionally stopping to stare out the window at the flickering lights of the city. Jonah, ever patient, finally interrupted. "You don't need a script, Riley. Just tell them what you know." The next morning, I stood backstage in a plain black dress and boots that still bore scuffs from my endless days walking to meetings I couldn't afford to Uber to. The conference hall wasn't huge, but it felt overwhelming. Rows of chairs filled with business owners, founders, young professionals hoping to glean wisdom. The same kind of crowd I would have been too afraid to face a year ago. When I stepped onto the stage, I didn't launch into stats or milestones. I started with the truth I was never supposed to be here. At least, not by my family's definition of success. I saw heads nodding in the audience. Faces leaned forward, hungry for something real. I spoke about the pressure of respectable careers, the weight of academic expectations, and the quiet defiance of choosing a different path. I told them about CraftCore's first contract and taking the bus to Spokane because my car was dead. I told them about working out of my apartment, standing meetings held, sitting on the floor, debugging inventory issues while eating cold pizza. And then I paused, because this was the moment that felt hardest to admit. I was winning, I said carefully, but I was winning alone. And I realized that if success required me to isolate myself completely, then it wasn't worth it. Not to me. The room fell utterly silent, the kind of silence that signals not boredom, but deep listening. Afterward, a line of people formed to shake my hand, ask questions, share their own struggles. Young founders thanked me for showing them that grit mattered more than pedigree. Older entrepreneurs admitted that they too sometimes felt like imposters. It was the first time in years I felt fully connected to a community instead of just performing for it. But that feeling of connection didn't last long because 2 days later, the past came calling. My mother's email was short, almost terse. "Your father's retirement party is next weekend. It would mean a lot if you attended. Emily and her husband will be there." No apology, no acknowledgement of the years of silence. Just an expectation, a summons wrapped in polite language. I stared at that email for a long time, conflicted. I didn't owe them anything. I knew that. But I also knew that not showing up would give them fuel for another story about my ungratefulness. So I did the unexpected. I replied simply, "I'll be there." But this time I would show up differently. Not as the quiet, shrinking daughter they remembered, but as myself, fully formed, unapologetic, and finally whole. The night of the party arrived faster than I expected. I wore a sharp blazer, jeans, and boots polished just enough to show I cared, but not enough to pretend I was trying to impress them. My hair pulled back, simply no makeup except a trace of eyeliner to define tired but clear eyes. As I walked into that suburban event hall rented for the occasion, decorated predictably with banners reading "Congratulations," Richard, and stock photos of retirement happiness, I felt the weight of old judgment bearing down. I could almost hear my father's voice critiquing my posture, my mother's cool gaze assessing whether I looked successful. But I walked tall. I greeted relatives with calm warmth, but didn't let myself shrink. When I saw Emily, she offered a polished smile, her husband at her side, both perfectly coiffed. "Riley," she said, her tone halfway between surprise and calculation. "We weren't sure you'd come." "I'm here," I replied simply. My father approached soon after, champagne in hand, eyes sharp as ever. "Still running that little online shop?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension, loud enough for a few nearby guests to overhear. I smiled gently. "Actually, Craftcore is now deployed in 56 stores across 6 states, and next month we go national." The look on his face was priceless. A flash of confusion, then recalculation. Before he could respond, my mother interjected, "That's impressive, Riley. Emily mentioned you've been busy, but I wasn't there to impress them. I was there to reclaim my own space." Later in the evening, as the formal speeches began, and my father soaked in polite applause, I stepped outside onto the patio. The air was cool, the stars scattered brilliantly above, and for the first time in a long while, I felt absolutely steady. I didn't belong here anymore, and that was okay. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their validation. I had built a life that they neither understood nor could diminish. As I leaned against the patio railing, a quiet clarity settled over me. My story wasn't about escaping their expectations. It was about defining success on my own terms and then living that definition fully. And that's when my phone buzzed a text from Jonah. "Big news when you get back," it read simply. "Good news. Game-changing." I smiled at the irony. Even in the middle of this symbolic confrontation with my past, the future was already calling. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and took one last look at the stars before heading back inside. I was ready, whatever that next chapter would be. When I got back from my father's retirement party that night, I didn't unpack. I dropped my blazer on the couch, kicked off my boots, and opened my laptop, curious but also uneasy about Jonah's game-changing news. My phone vibrated again almost as soon as I logged in another text from Jonah. "Call me as soon as you're home." I hit dial immediately. Jonah's voice was buzzing with excitement, but also restraint, like he was holding back something big. "You won't believe this. I took a meeting today with an investor accidentally, honestly. I was at a meetup and mentioned Craftcore, and this guy, Alan Fisher, VP at Pacific Capital, overheard me. He's been following us. Quietly. He wants to talk about serious funding. And Riley, he knows about Maple and Sage, about all the regional chains we've signed. He says Craftcore's growth is exactly what they're looking for." I sat down exhausted, but suddenly alert. Alan Fisher, Pacific Capital, real institutional money. The kind of investment that could take Craftcore from a scrappy apartment-born startup to something truly scalable. "How serious?" I asked carefully. Jonah paused just long enough to make me nervous. "He's thinking 7 figures. Growth capital to expand the engineering team, improve infrastructure, build a sales department, real marketing spend." I leaned back, processing it all. 7 figures. For months, I'd lived on the edge of financial collapse, watching every dollar rationing coffee and ramen while patching together enterprise-grade software from a cold, dim apartment. And now someone wanted to hand us a lifeline, but a lifeline came with strings. It was tempting. So tempting. But the question hit hard and fast. What would we have to give up control, direction, our soul? That night, I barely slept. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment from when I walked out of my parents' house to now. Every risk I'd taken, every quiet victory, every scar. Craftcore was mine, not just in name, but in DNA. It wasn't built in boardrooms or focus groups. It was built in late nights and cold mornings and determination that defied my own doubt. But I also knew we were reaching a limit. Jonah was exhausted. I was exhausted. And the cracks would widen unless we found a way to grow responsibly. The next morning, I asked Jonah to set up a meeting. Not at some shiny office, but at a corner coffee shop near the waterfront. I wanted to look Alan Fisher in the eye, see what kind of man he was, not just what kind of checkbook he carried. When I walked in, Alan was already waiting. Mid-50s, tailored gray suit, but no tie. Clean cut, but casual in a way that felt deliberate. He smiled as I approached, but didn't offer the usual condescending handshake I'd grown used to in tech spaces. "Riley Carter," he said warmly. Been waiting a while to meet you." We sat. No pitch deck, no rehearsed speech, just conversation. Alan spoke honestly, almost too honestly for a VC. "I respect what you've built. Real contracts, real revenue, not another vaporware pitch." He paused, leaning forward. "But I can also see you're at an inflection point. Craftcore is growing faster than you can sustain on grit alone. That's why I'm interested. I'm not just investing in your company, I'd be investing in your discipline, your energy, your instinct." It sounded good, too good. I challenged him directly. "And what would you want in return? Board seats, voting rights, control." Alan didn't flinch. "A minority stake? No board seat unless you invite me. I just want in early before Craftcore gets crowded with copycats." That was the first twist he didn't want to take over. He wanted to back me. After the meeting, I sat by the water and watched the ferries glide by the wind cold against my face. I thought about how far I'd come from begging for a single artisan to trust me to having a professional investor chasing me. But I also thought about what Evelyn had said that night at the library. The hardest thing is not disappearing inside your work. If I took Alan's money, Craftcore would grow fast, maybe too fast. We'd go from 5 people to 50. We'd have layers of management structure reporting oversight. No more sitting on crates coding side by side. Would I lose the very thing that had made Craftcore different? Would I lose myself? But another voice inside me whispered something uncomfortable and true. Maybe I already was losing myself, burning out, isolating, unable to trust, unable to ask for help. In the end, the decision wasn't just about capital. It was about trust. Trust that I could grow Craftcore without losing its heart. Trust that I could build a team without disappearing as a leader. Trust that I could rewrite my story, not just repeat my parents' rigid ideas of success or failure. So I called Jonah that evening and said the words I never thought I would say, "Let's do this," but on our terms. We negotiated carefully. Alan agreed to a $1.8 million investment for 20% equity minority, non-controlling, no board seat unless we invited him later. No golden parachutes, no meddling, just cash to build. That was the next big leap. Within a month, Craftcore had moved out of my apartment and into a small industrial space on the east side of town, a converted warehouse with exposed brick and battered wood beams that felt authentic and imperfect, just like us. I hired carefully. No suits, no jargon, no pretenders. People who'd been laid off, overlooked, doubted, just like I had been. People who knew how to grind and care at the same time. And something unexpected happened. I started sleeping better. I stopped feeling like every contract might be the last. I started feeling for the first time in years like I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was leading. But with growth came new kinds of tension. The media finally caught up to us. Small blogs at first, then local press. From dropout to CEO, the young woman reshaping retail software. I smiled at the headline, but it felt surreal. Then my sister Emily forwarded the article to my parents. I didn't expect a response, but I got one. A text from my father. Short, blunt, saw the article. Proud of you. Proud of me. After all the years of silence and judgment, after dismissing my work as a little online shop. The words were what I thought I wanted all along, but now that they arrived, they felt strangely empty. Because I didn't need them anymore. I wasn't building Craftcore to win back their respect. I was building it because I believed in it. Because I believed in myself. That night, I sat alone in the new office surrounded by unpacked boxes and the hum of servers warming up. I opened a bottle of cheap red wine and poured a glass not to celebrate my father's approval, but to mark this strange milestone where his opinion finally stopped mattering. And then just as I sipped, another email arrived, a chain 10 times the size of Maple and Sage. A national brand. Their subject line, RFP. We need a modern retail management platform. Are you interested? I laughed quietly into my glass. The stakes were bigger now, the risks sharper, but I wasn't afraid. I was ready. The next chapter was already writing itself, and I was determined to write it my way. When that email landed, We need a modern retail management platform. Are you interested? I felt the familiar adrenaline surge, but this time it wasn't panic, it was readiness. The sender was one of the largest national craft chains in the US, nearly 200 stores coast to coast, a name I'd seen on shopping bags my entire life. The kind of client who could double our revenue in a single deal. The kind of client that used to feel out of reach. And yet, as I sat there in the half-empty office, the cheap red wine still in my glass, I didn't hesitate. I clicked reply and wrote simply, "Absolutely. Let's schedule a call." I didn't feel imposter syndrome anymore. Craftcore wasn't an idea or a fragile dream. It was working, scaling, delivering. And I wasn't a dropout scrambling for scraps. I was a founder who had earned every inch of this ground. But with that growth came risk, and I knew it. The call was scheduled for Thursday. 3 days to prepare a proposal that could position us against legacy players with 10 times the resources and decades of market presence. Our product was leaner, faster, cleaner, but we were smaller, scrappier. And clients this size didn't just want innovation, they wanted reliability. I gathered the team. Not a boardroom full of execs, just Jonah Rachel, our new lead engineer, and Dominic, a UX designer we'd brought on during the last round of growth. We sat on mismatched chairs around a folding table and mapped out every question this client might ask. Could we handle multi-location inventory at scale? Could we integrate with their preferred logistics providers? How fast could we deploy? How ironclad was our uptime guarantee? It was symbolic in a way that didn't escape me, 4 of us most without fancy degrees. None from privileged backgrounds sitting in a converted warehouse plotting a bid against multi-million-dollar competitors. The very thing my parents would have sneered at not long ago. A real company doesn't look like that, Riley. But they were wrong. Late that night, while everyone else packed up, Jonah stayed back. He closed his laptop quietly, looked at me and said, "You know they'll push us harder than anyone else because we're small. We'll have to fight for every inch." I nodded, not dismissing it. "Yeah, but we're used to that." And I meant it. My whole life had been that fight against low expectations, against quiet dismissal, against the belief that credentials mattered more than capability. The call on Thursday was sharp and fast. Their VP of operations led the meeting, her voice crisp, efficient. "Your product looks promising, Riley, but this isn't a charity project. Why should we trust Craftcore? Why you?" I didn't blink. Because we built Craftcore for exactly the kinds of challenges you face: inventory chaos across locations, outdated legacy systems, fragmented customer data. And we didn't just build this from theory, we built it fighting for every single client. No bloated features, no unnecessary overhead, just what your managers and staff actually need today. There was a pause, a long one, the kind that used to fill me with dread. And then we like that answer. "Send us your formal proposal by Monday. We'll be reviewing side by side with 2 larger vendors." It was exactly what I expected, a fair shot, but not an easy one. A chance to prove ourselves in a space dominated by older, better-funded players. The next 3 days became a sprint like none before. I worked through nights and early mornings sitting at the same battered table where Craftcore was born, sketching out deployment schedules, pricing tiers, support guarantees. Rachel stayed late tweaking the UX mockups so that everything we showed looked not just functional, but elegant. Jonah rewrote parts of our backend just to ensure scalability before we even had the contract signed. I saw what this meant to all of them, not just a big client, but validation. Proof that their work mattered, that our work mattered. And it wasn't lost on me that every late night we pulled was driven by a common belief that talent and grit could outperform legacy and pedigree if given the chance. By Sunday night, the proposal was done. Clean, professional, competitive without underpricing. I sent it with a short, confident note, "We're ready to help you move forward." That evening, I sat quietly in my apartment, feeling the exhaustion catch up at last. I thought about my mother's text from weeks earlier, about my father's terse, "proud of you" message. And I realized how much of my life I had spent unconsciously framing everything through their eyes. Even this moment, even now, I could hear their voices. You think you can compete at that level? You think you belong there? But this time the voices felt small, faint, powerless. The truth was, I did belong here. I belonged exactly where I was, not because anyone said so, but because I had built this from scratch with nothing but determination, late nights, and stubborn belief. And then another thought hit me, a deeper, almost uncomfortable one. Maybe I wasn't building craftcore in spite of my upbringing. Maybe I was building it because of it. All those years in that house learning how to survive dismissal, rejection, indifference, it was training in a way. Preparation for exactly this fight. That insight didn't soften the pain of it, but it gave it meaning. My past wasn't an anchor anymore. It was fuel. On Tuesday morning, the reply came. They had chosen craftcore. It was a moment I thought would feel triumphant, and it did briefly. But what surprised me was how quickly that feeling faded into something calmer, resolve. This was just the next step, not a finish line. We hadn't arrived. We'd earned a chance. When I gathered the team that morning, I didn't make a speech. I just looked around at the mismatched chairs, the simple whiteboard, the coffee-stained mugs, and said quietly, "We're doing this. Together. And we're ready." And they understood exactly what that meant. Longer hours, harder work, bigger problems. But none of them hesitated. That night, as I sat at my desk alone again, I got another email. This one from Evelyn. She'd heard the news through a mutual contact. Her message was short but perfect. "Remember what I told you the first time we met? You don't need to disappear inside your work. Hold on to that now. The stakes just got higher." I read it twice, smiled to myself, and finally allowed a small breath of pride. She was right. Craftcore was bigger than me now, but that didn't mean I had to lose myself again. As I closed my laptop for the night, I looked out at the city lights reflecting on the water. This was my life now, fast, imperfect, high stakes, and mine. And even as the weight of this next chapter settled in, I knew something had shifted permanently. I no longer lived inside anyone else's definition of success, not my parents', not society's, not even my own from a year ago. I was writing my own script now, fully. And tomorrow the work would begin again, this time with no doubt. Story 2. My name is Ethan Carter. And at 24, I had already learned how invisible a son could become when measured against the wrong yardstick. I'll never forget that evening sitting silently at my parents' oversized dining table while my older sister Emily basked in their glowing praise for her glamorous marketing career in New York. "I built this life with my hands," I wanted to say. I run a thriving carpentry and renovation business at 24. But all my mother could ask was, "So Ethan, any new birdhouses this week?" The whole table laughed, not realizing how those words were knives. But there was something they didn't know and that I never intended them to discover. For 2 years, I had been secretly paying their mortgage. Without those birdhouse dollars, they would have lost the very roof over their heads. Let me take you back. I wasn't the golden child. That title belonged to Emily, 2 years older than me, polished and camera-ready since birth. She went to an Ivy League school, landed a cushy marketing job, and posted about rooftop brunches with hedge fund boyfriends. In contrast, I fixed things. From a young age, I could take apart the broken toaster and put it back together better. My parents barely noticed. When I was 18, I skipped college and apprenticed with an old-school contractor who taught me not just skills, but pride. By 21, I was running my own small renovation business, no debt, a reliable truck my name recommended around town. I was booked solid months ahead and earning good money, but you wouldn't know that from the way my parents treated me. My dad, a retired accountant, kept printing job postings for real careers. My mom gently suggested night school to have options in case your woodworking doesn't pan out. And Emily, she could do no wrong. She was the star, the Instagram influencer in a designer coat and the center of every conversation. But what they didn't realize was that while they marveled at Emily's selfies from corporate retreats, I had been quietly keeping them afloat. I overheard them one night whispers in the kitchen about overdue bills and the looming threat of foreclosure on the family home. My dad's pension had fallen short, and unexpected medical expenses had eaten away what they had saved. They never asked me for help, probably because in their eyes I was barely scraping by. I didn't say a word. I just logged into my bank account and set up an automatic payment, $1,800 every month, disguised as a transfer from an old retirement account they forgot they even had. 2 years passed like this. 2 years of me saving their home in silence while they praised Emily for being on track and making us proud. At every family gathering, I was background noise. Emily's career was discussed in glowing detail while my work was treated like a quirky hobby. The irony, I was doing kitchen remodels for city officials, designing bespoke decks for people with 7-figure salaries. I was so booked, I had to turn jobs away. My friends knew how well I was doing. My parents, they preferred to pretend I was finding myself. Then one day, I noticed something odd about Emily. Her social media feed, once filled with tagged locations and slick corporate offices, changed. Gone were the photos from fancy conference rooms. Instead, there were vague posts like power lunch with the team, but no restaurant tags. The same stock photo of a city skyline showed up more than once, posted months apart, pretending it was from her office window. Emily came home less often, too, and when she did, she skillfully dodged any real questions about work. "I'm super busy," she'd say, breezily deflecting any curiosity with a laugh. "Just another quarter of hustle." Ryan, her polished hedge fund boyfriend, wasn't the same either. Last time he visited, he looked anxious, distracted. When my dad asked for stock tips like he always did, Ryan nervously said he couldn't discuss the market right now. And that's when I heard them, Emily and Ryan, arguing in hushed voices out back. "You can't keep this up," Ryan hissed. "Just give me a little more time," Emily snapped back. Their voices dropped when they spotted me nearby, their smiles instantly pasted on as they hurried inside. That moment stuck with me. I started paying more attention, noticing inconsistencies everywhere. Her Audi, which she boasted about endlessly online, was supposedly in the shop for 3 months, so she always borrowed Mom's car. She kept forgetting her wallet when we went out for dinner. Her designer shopping bags empty, reused from months earlier. Her posts online still screamed success, but in person, the cracks were showing. I tried gently probing my parents. "Hey, Emily seems a bit stressed about work, doesn't she?" I asked my mom one afternoon. But my mother cut me off fast, eyes sharp. "Not everyone is content fixing cabinets, Ethan. Your sister is under real pressure, high-level professional stress. Not like your projects. That's what she called the custom mahogany kitchen I had just installed for the city's deputy mayor. Dad just nodded along, adding, "She's a rising star. Important clients. Big deals. You wouldn't understand." I laughed bitterly, silently to myself. They truly didn't see me. They couldn't even imagine that I was the one quietly keeping them housed. But I saw something else, something that worried me more. Emily's life didn't add up. Her story was starting to unravel, and no one but me seemed willing to notice. That's when I made a decision. If they wanted to keep living in their fantasy, fine. But I would start digging for the truth, because this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about how far Emily had gone to maintain an illusion and how much longer I could let it slide. In the days after that awkward family dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about Emily's unraveling facade. The sharp, polished, corporate golden girl they all adored was slipping, and I was the only one who seemed to notice or care. But what struck me hardest wasn't her lies. It was my parents' absolute refusal to see her flaws. They worshipped at the altar of her success, even as the cracks widened. And me, I was standing right there, quietly holding their entire house together financially and literally, and they treated me like some drifter with a hobby. The next week, I made a decision. I needed clarity for myself more than them. So I did something that felt a little risky, maybe a little invasive, but honestly, enough was enough. I sat in my truck that night and looked up the company where Emily claimed to work. A swanky marketing agency in Manhattan, all clean lines and expensive branding. Their website had a page for their leadership team, of course. I clicked through every smiling executive portrait. Emily's name not there, not even in the account managers section. I searched their staff directory. Nothing. At first, I thought maybe I'd missed something. I double-checked the spelling, scrolled back through her Instagram to look for a tag. Then it hit me, her posts hadn't tagged the company in months. The supposed promotions, the high-profile clients, all of it was vague captions and recycled photos. I felt a cold rush run through me, something between concern and vindication. She was lying. And not just a little embellishment, this was a full fabrication. But the weirdest part was how empty I felt. I thought that uncovering this would give me a rush of gotcha energy, like a moment to finally stick it to them. Instead, I felt this strange hollowness. Like I'd just confirmed what I already knew. Deep down, our family was built on appearances, not substance. Emily's downfall wasn't going to be some explosive revelation, I realized. It was going to be a slow, painful collapse, one my parents would refuse to accept until the very end. And they would probably drag me down in the process if I let them. A few days later, Mom cornered me in the kitchen with a cheerful but thinly veiled request. "Your father and I have been thinking," she began, twirling her wine glass absent-mindedly, "and we feel it's time you contribute a bit more while you're living here. Maybe some rent utilities. It's only fair, sweetheart." I froze. Rent utilities. The roof over their heads was being kept up by my direct deposit payments, month after month payments they didn't even know about, because they couldn't fathom that their underachieving son could possibly afford such generosity. The irony tasted bitter in my throat. "Sure, Mom," I replied carefully, holding back the storm rising inside me. "Why don't you ask Emily too? I mean, she's doing so well. All those bonuses." My mom stiffened. The air between us thickened. "Your sister has real responsibilities, Ethan," she said, her voice sharp and clipped. "She's building her career. It's not the same." There it was again, that invisible hierarchy. Emily could lie and falter and still be their perfect daughter. I could quietly save them from losing their home and still be treated like a freeloading child. That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts spun faster than I could stop them. My business was thriving. I had jobs booked out for 3 months, a secondhand pickup I'd paid off in cash, and clients who respected my work enough to hand me 6-figure projects. And yet, here I was being guilt-tripped for rent money on a house whose mortgage I paid. In the dark, I stared at the ceiling and thought about something that felt almost too obvious. Why hadn't I moved out yet? Why was I still here, surrounded by people who refused to see me clearly? The truth was, I stayed because some small part of me was still chasing their approval, still hoping they'd wake up one day and realize I wasn't their failure son. I decided the next day I'd start looking for a place of my own. But before I could act, a new twist arrived, subtle but seismic. Ryan, Emily's hedge fund boyfriend, showed up alone for Sunday lunch. No warning, no Emily. He looked wrecked. Pale, jittery, not the confident Wall Street guy we were used to. He barely touched his food, and when Dad asked him about market trends, Ryan mumbled something about not being able to discuss pending investigations. Investigations. That word felt heavy in the air. After lunch, while Mom fussed over coffee, I caught Ryan outside on the patio. I didn't intend to pry. I honestly felt bad for him, but something in his demeanor practically begged for someone to ask. "Everything okay?" I asked simply. Ryan gave me this hollow look. "No," he muttered. "Everything's falling apart." Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "Emily hasn't worked for that firm in over a year. She's been pretending. She lost her job, lied to everyone. She's drowning in debt, Ethan. I tried to help, but she won't stop spinning lies. She's not who you think she is." The wind seemed to still around us. For a few seconds, we just stood there, two guys on opposite ends of this absurd family drama, and neither of us had any words left. He left soon after, muttering excuses, but I stood on that patio long after he was gone. This was the moment I'd been anticipating and dreading all along. Proof. Hard, undeniable proof that Emily's house of cards had collapsed, and nobody but me seemed to see it. But I also knew my parents wouldn't believe it coming from me. Not yet. They were too invested in her image, in their version of success and status. In their minds, I was still just the boy tinkering in the garage, not the man quietly saving their futures. That night, I sat down at my workbench and drafted a plan, my plan. The next chapter was coming, and I wouldn't just sit back and let them keep rewriting this story. I would write the ending myself. After that conversation with Ryan, something inside me snapped, not in rage, but in clarity. I saw the entire charade for what it was, a crumbling facade held together by denial and selective attention. My parents weren't just ignoring red flags. They were choosing to blind themselves because it was easier than accepting that their perfect daughter's life was built on lies. I realized then that this wasn't just about Emily. It was about their need to uphold an image at all costs. The next morning, I began preparing to leave. I couldn't breathe under this roof anymore. I started packing my tools first. My work mattered more than any of this family drama. Every wrench, every chisel and saw felt like a symbol of what I had built in contrast to the illusions they all clung to. While I loaded crates into my truck, my mother appeared in the driveway, coffee mug in hand, watching me with narrowed eyes. "Going somewhere?" she asked casually, though her tone was sharp. I took a breath. "Yeah, I'm moving out soon. It's time." Her face froze for a moment, then softened into something resembling pity, but not quite. "You know, we worry about you, Ethan. This handyman phase, it's not a future." I nearly laughed at the absurdity of her words. She couldn't fathom that I was making more than most of her friends' so-called successful children, but I held my tongue. I was done arguing for my legitimacy in this house. That evening, sitting at my workbench, I finally put my plan into motion. I printed every mortgage payment receipt from the last 2 years. 48 pages, cold, factual proof of the roof I'd kept over their heads. I slipped them into a manila envelope, scrawling one line across the front, for when the truth matters more than the performance. It felt almost poetic in a sad way. But the next twist wasn't mine to write. The very next day, my father pulled me aside in the living room. His voice was low, almost hesitant, a rare thing for him. "Ethan, do you know why Emily hasn't returned any of our calls this week?" The question caught me off guard. For all their blindness, even they couldn't ignore how scarce she had become. I shrugged, forcing myself to play dumb. Not sure. Busy, maybe, but I could see it in his face. The cracks were finally creeping in. That night, it happened, the collapse I had seen coming, but never imagined would unfold this quickly. Around 9 p.m., my father received a phone call. I watched from the kitchen doorway as he answered, listened, and slowly sat down, his shoulders slumping in a way I'd never seen before. My mother rushed in, alarmed. I couldn't hear everything, but certain words floated across the room, landing like grenades in the air fired months ago. Tens of thousands in debt, eviction notice, credit cards maxed out. Emily's perfect life was a complete fabrication. She'd been lying not just to them, but to everyone. When he hung up, my father sat there in silence for a long moment before looking directly at me for what felt like the first time in years. His expression was blank, exhausted. My mother, however, refused to crumble. She immediately began spinning excuses. She must have felt pressured. The economy's been hard. These things happen. Her words were frantic, brittle, as if she could patch over the truth by speaking quickly enough. But even she couldn't deny it anymore. I said nothing, just watched as their carefully curated world began to disintegrate. Later that night, while they sat shell-shocked in the living room, I quietly packed the rest of my belongings. Every tool, every notebook full of measurements and sketches, every reminder that I had built something real. As I worked, I kept thinking about the core of this whole mess: appearances. My parents were so obsessed with looking successful, looking like the perfect family, that they had ignored substance entirely. Emily was their ideal because she wore the right clothes and lived in the right city. I was invisible because I chose calloused hands and dirty boots. Even as I packed, my mother called after me from the hallway. "You can't just leave now," she pleaded. "We need you. We need help figuring this out." The irony stung. I had been helping all along, and they never even noticed. Before I left, I placed the manila envelope on the kitchen counter right next to my mother's glass of Chardonnay. I didn't leave a note, no grand goodbye. Just the facts my quiet contribution documented in black and white. The next morning, I drove out before sunrise, my truck loaded and my workshop keys dangling from the rearview mirror like a talisman. As I crossed the bridge out of town, I felt an almost surreal calm. This wasn't just a move. This was emancipation. But as I glanced back at the shrinking skyline of my hometown, I realized something bitter and freeing all at once. They would probably still find a way to blame me. My leaving would become the new family story. Ethan, the bitter son who abandoned us just when we needed him most. That was the cost of truth in this family. But here's the thing that no one talks about. Freedom has its own weight. It's not just release, it's responsibility. I was walking away from their illusions, yes, but I was also stepping fully into the life I had built for myself. By the time I reached my new place, a small but sunlit apartment above a cabinet shop where I could finally set up my own workshop, I felt lighter than I had in years. I unlocked the door, let the quiet space greet me, and sat down on the hardwood floor. No furniture yet, just the bare bones of a new chapter. As I looked around, I realized that this moment, this silence, was mine. Not borrowed, not conditional, not judged. I was no longer the shadow son. But somewhere deep down, I knew the story wasn't quite finished. My parents hadn't seen the envelope yet. Emily hadn't returned their calls, and despite everything, some part of me still wondered what would happen when they finally opened that folder and learned just how much I had done for them. That thought settled into my chest, a knot of anticipation and dread, because sooner or later that moment was coming, and I would be ready. In the days after I moved out, silence became my closest companion. My phone stayed stubbornly quiet at first. No calls, no messages from my parents. I knew they had seen the envelope by now. I could imagine them sitting at that heavy oak table, my mother clutching her wine glass a little too tight, while my father shuffled through the printouts, adding up the sum they'd overlooked page after page. Every payment was a quiet rebuttal to years of dismissal. Yet I also knew them well enough to predict their pride would keep them quiet until they found a way to spin the narrative back into something that fit their world. So I waited. In my little apartment above the cabinet shop, surrounded by stacks of lumber and half-finished blueprints, I worked. Real work, honest, demanding, tangible. My first night there, I fell asleep on the floor beside a freshly sanded workbench, exhausted but strangely at peace. No judgment hanging in the air. No disapproving glances over dinner. Just me, my tools, and the sound of my own breathing. The first call came 5 days later. It was my mother, of course. Her voice was fragile but carefully composed, like she was walking a tightrope between apology and justification. "Ethan, your father and I have been thinking. We didn't realize all you've done. We just want you to come for dinner this weekend so we can talk." It was tempting, that invitation. Part of me still craved what I'd always craved: recognition, validation, a simple acknowledgement of who I really was. But I also knew better. I could almost hear what the conversation would sound like: a reluctant thank you, wrapped in condescension, a plea for help disguised as reconciliation. No, I couldn't go back into that house, not yet, maybe not ever, so I declined, gently but firmly. "Mom, I need some time. I'm happy to help where I can, but I can't come over right now. I'm building something here, something that matters." Her pause said everything. "Fine," she said after a beat, voice tight. "Take your time." After that, the floodgates opened, but not in the way I expected. My parents began reaching out in smaller ways. An email from my father mortgage's current statement attached thanks for helping before. "We'll manage from here." Manage, that was his word for it. As if admitting they'd been oblivious for 2 years was too much to bear. Then there was the card that arrived in my mailbox a week later in my mother's careful script. Inside was a single line. "We didn't know how much you've grown. Maybe we didn't want to know." No apology, no admission of fault, just that cryptic sentence. I tucked the card into a drawer and didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because I needed space to figure out who I was without their shadow hanging over every decision. But Emily's story? That was still unfolding. Word began to trickle through the family grapevine. Emily hadn't just lost her job. She was drowning deep debt, eviction notices, burned bridges. Her carefully curated Instagram life had become a house of mirrors, and now the reflections were shattering one by one. I resisted the urge to call her. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility to catch her when she fell. But then one evening, as I was closing up the shop, my phone rang. Emily's name on the screen. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the decline button, but curiosity, or maybe compassion, got the better of me. I answered. Her voice was small, stripped of its usual polish. "Hey," she said quietly. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from." I didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch. I wanted you to know I'm sorry," she continued. I messed up everything." There it was, her collapse finally voiced out loud. But instead of satisfaction, I felt only sadness. Not pity, just sadness for the life she'd felt compelled to fake, the pressures she'd bowed to, the image she'd built and destroyed. "Are you okay?" I asked finally, genuinely. "No," she admitted, voice cracking. "But I'm trying. I've moved in with a friend. I'm selling my car to pay off part of the debt. I'm looking for real work this time." It hit me then how deeply we were both shaped by the same household, the same warped metrics of success, the same need for approval, hers expressed in overcompensation, mine in quiet resentment. And in that moment, I realized something important: I didn't have to keep carrying this family's emotional weight anymore. Not hers, not my parents'. I could care without saving love, without sacrificing myself. "Good," I said gently. "That's a start. Just keep going." We ended the call without promises, but for once it felt real. Two siblings stripped of pretense, talking honestly for maybe the first time ever. Weeks passed, and my new life began to settle into place. Clients kept coming, referrals kept growing. I hired a part-time assistant to help with invoicing and logistics. My little shop, my sanctuary, was thriving. One evening, as I sanded the edges of a custom dining table, I realized that every groove, every smooth corner, every polished joint was proof of something that couldn't be dismissed or belittled: real work, real care, real value. I thought about how in this family value had always been measured in appearances, college degrees on a wall, designer clothes, job titles that sounded important at cocktail parties. But this table in my hands, crafted from raw lumber into something strong and useful. This was value too. Honest, undeniable, and mine. And that's when the real twist hit me. I didn't need them to recognize it anymore. Their approval had been the ghost I chased for too long. Let them believe whatever they needed to protect their illusions. I was done performing for them. The next morning, I drafted one last email. To my parents, short, polite, final. "I hope you're doing okay. I'll continue the mortgage payments for 3 more months to give you time to make arrangements. After that, it's yours to manage. Thank you for everything that did shape me, good and bad. Take care." And just like that, I felt free. The house I saved. It wasn't my home, Emily's lies. Not my burden. Their disappointment, not my reflection. As I locked up my shop that evening, I looked around at the walls I'd built myself, the tools I'd earned, and the life I was finally living on my own terms. For the first time, the future felt wide open, mine to craft piece by piece, honest and real. And whatever came next, I was ready.